The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. You're here to learn about how recent TCPA rulings and the CFPB's Outline of Proposed Rules could impact you and your business. So let's get started. Thanks to all of you for registering for this Neustar webinar produced by Inside ARM. We'll have plenty of time today for our presenters to go through key points as well as to answer your questions about the presentation. I'm joined today by Becky Burr, Mark Brennan, Mitchell Young, and Brad Day. Becky Burr serves as Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy General Counsel for Neustar. As Neustar's Chief Privacy Officer, Ms. Burr is responsible for ensuring that the company maintains state-of-the-art privacy practices that always protect customer and consumer information. Ms. Burr was previously a partner at Wilmer Hale, practicing in the Communications, Privacy, and Internet Law Practice Group. She also is a veteran of the Federal Trade Commission and the Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration. At the FTC, Ms. Burr was responsible for competition and consumer protection policy in connection with information industry and electronic information infrastructure. She participated in developing the FTC's approach to competition, consumer protection, and privacy and data protection in the digital marketplace. Mark Brennan is a partner at Hogan Lovells US LLP. Clients across industry sectors seek Mark's practical advice on cutting-edge communications and privacy issues. An experienced advisor, Mark is as comfortable assisting clients on FCC and FTC policy and enforcement as he is at providing actionable compliance strategies to operations teams. He receives dozens of requests each year to share his insights on consumer protection issues at industry conferences and is most well known for obtaining significant victories for clients on Telephone Consumer Protection Act issues. Mitchell Young is the Executive Director of Fraud, Risk, and Compliance at Neustar, where he oversees the collections, financial services, call center, and data verticals. Mitchell has been at Neustar for 11 years, helping companies leverage real-time identity data and analytic insights to improve operational efficiencies and manage risk compliance. Mitchell has an undergraduate degree from Penn State and an MBA from New York University. Brad Day is the Principal and CEO at Days End Consulting. Brad's consulting work in the collections market includes helping clients with analysis, planning, and implementation regarding TCPA compliance. He brings an operational analytics focus, which uses data to drive repeatable, high-performance operational behavior. His clients include government agencies, issuers, banks, collection agencies, and debt buyers. And I'm Doug Johnson, Editorial Project Manager for the IA Institute and an editor at Inside ARM. A few pieces of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. We'll have the webinar formatted and available for viewing within 5 days of today. All of your microphones have been muted. If you have a question during the presentation, send it via the chat box and we'll address it. The final bit of housekeeping, I've got some legalese I need to read through on the record, so please bear with me. This information is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to assure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area, however, nor should it be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. And with all that out of the way, we can get right into it. I'm going to turn things over to Mitchell.
Great. Thank you, Doug, and welcome everybody. We look forward to walking you through this webinar today. I'm going to walk you through the agenda first, and I'm going to serve as the moderator. Let me get things moving. All right, so I'm going to back up one slide. Okay, so here's the agenda for today. I'm going to walk through a bit of context and introductions and set the table for where we are today and what we're going to cover. The agenda, we've broken this into three main sections. The first is going to be a legal analysis, and it's going to be a discussion with Mark and Becky, and we're going to look at a few things, some recent TCPA cases and how they are impacting the declaratory ruling and all the work that all companies are doing around TCPA. We'll talk a bit about the CFPB proposed ruling. We'll also talk about some of the recent government federal debt rules, and then we'll talk about the Trump administration and what a changing administration means for TCPA. Secondly, we'll move to an operational analysis, and we'll talk with Brad Day about a framework that he uses with companies tackling TCPA, and he works across companies in first-party, third-party, banking, financial services, collections. We'll talk about common issues that he sees as he's working with companies addressing TCPA, who's often involved, and some best practices. The third piece will be a case study where we look at both a risk assessment and a new Skiptrace solution that Neustar is rolling out, and we look at how addressing TCPA also brings operational efficiencies, and looking at kind of the two sides of that coin as we work with companies looking at the portfolio of phone numbers they have and how they go about actually communicating and operationalizing their outreach to customers. We'll then open up to Q&A, and everyone will be here. Mark, Becky, Brad, myself will stay around to the end. I believe we have about 45, 50 minutes of content, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. If we go a little long, if the content takes an hour, we'll still reserve 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So a little sense of who's here today. We had 300 people register for this webinar, and it's across the banking, collections, verticals. So I think there's a mix of people dealing with first-party collection issues, third-party collection issues, and a big audience. So what we know is that TCPA continues to be certainly in the forefront for companies in collections. So in terms of the current TCPA environment and the regulatory environment, this is the lens that we look at it from. There's a lot of issues. Certainly, unwanted calls and texts are still one of the #1 complaints that the FCC receives. The environment is still one that's heavily litigious. The lens that we look at it through from Neustar's perspective is also around the phone data. And one of the big shifts that TCPA has forced is the shift in phone data and moving from a quantity of phone data to a quality of phone data. And it's a substantive difference that the industry has had to adopt as it looks at reaching customers and mitigating the financial risk that comes with outbound calls, making sure they get to the right customers. And then we have the CFPB proposed rules, which is further pushing a shift towards RPC efficiency via limited contact attempts. We'll talk about it a bit, but in the proposed ruling, it had suggested a limit of 6 contacts per week to a consumer, whether it's by mail or email or phone or text. And while the industry in collections is very efficient, driving RPC efficiency with limited contacts attempts is a further shift towards quality and RPC efficiency that we see, and certainly an area where we believe we can help. The final thing, which the new administration coming in January certainly puts a lot of things in question of just what's going to happen when they're there, and how can a change in tone and interest impact what the regulatory agencies do and how things are enforced. And then we look at this person on the slide, and I never really know if our marketing group meant that to be the consumer that's receiving the unwanted call, or whether that's everybody on the phone, whether they're in the operations or compliance, just as equally frustrated and having to deal with TCPA. So I think it's fair to say that everyone's equally frustrated, and we'll dig in. One of the things we certainly know, though, even though there may be some changes in administrations, is that lawsuits are still on the rise. And I think this is the threat of TCPA that everybody faces. It's less around regulatory enforcement, and it's much more the financial impact that class action lawsuits and lawsuits pose, and the operational drain it takes on organizations as they have to respond to these lawsuits. So we've seen a continued rise in these over the years, and I don't think we've seen any change in that growth. So that's the context to date. We'll now move into a legal analysis and talk about TCPA trends and the regulatory environment. So where we'll start is the declaratory ruling. The FCC delivered a declaratory ruling in 2015. And what you see on the slide here today are, some of the core aspects of that ruling that has really driven a lot of TCPA efforts in the collections industry. So we won't go through these in detail. I think people have seen these a lot and they've been covered. But what I would like to hear from Mark and Becky is there have been a lot of cases over the last 6 or 8 months. Some seem to confirm this declaratory ruling interpretation. Others seem to refute it. There's appeals in clarifying things. Mark, maybe I'd ask you to start. Can you talk about the current lay of the land as it relates to cases and appeals and what you see happening with TCPA?
Certainly, and thanks very much, and thanks to Neustar for having me here. Delighted to talk with all of you, and also thanks to Inside ARM. The case law is certainly a very complex patchwork right now. There have been a number of courts that over the course of the year plus that we've had since the FCC released its 2015 omnibus TCPA decision that have had a chance to look at one or more of the issues that were teed up in that decision. So these are not cases where all of the issues are teed up in a dispute, but rather courts have looked at whether the FCC auto dialer interpretation should be followed, whether it was correct, and if they want to follow it, what the contours were for which technologies constitute an auto dialer. And I mean, here's the bottom line on what we've seen from the cases interpreting the decision and applying it to specific facts. I'll get to the appeal in a moment. But for the cases that have looked at the order for pending litigation, I think a number of courts, and the majority of them, have taken relatively reasonable approaches, relatively reasonable interpretations and applications of what was widely seen as a very overbroad FCC interpretation. So the FCC was too broad, but the courts have typically found ways to in practice take a more measured approach to applying the decision. The problem has been on the auto dialer issues that there are still some courts that are keeping open or the possibility for fully embracing the FCC's decision and the very broad interpretation or potential interpretation of the auto dialer definition. And so what that means is we don't yet have any type of nationwide comfort from the court decisions. The other issue is that the FCC's 2015 decision made it very difficult to avoid at least some level of factual investigation about the calling technologies in a particular matter, which itself has been a problem for the defense side. On issues like the calls to reassign numbers, that's actually something where there had been a few court decisions before the FCC issued its decision, and again, that continues to be a patchwork of conflicting decisions. So as many of you know, the FCC's decision itself was appealed to the DC Circuit last year by a coalition of parties, and ACA had been the lead petitioner and continues to be the lead petitioner in the case. The key issues teed up for appeal and court review here of the FCC's decision are the definition of an auto dialer, the interpretation of an auto dialer, the interpretation of called party. So when the statute says you need prior express consent of the called party, what does that mean? And also the FCC's consent revocation standard, so that which says the consumers can revoke consent at any time through any reasonable means. The oral arguments in that case were earlier in October, and as a general guide, the DC Circuit tends to issue its decisions about 10 weeks after oral arguments, and there's certainly plenty of exceptions to that guide, but that would put a decision due sometime later this month, sometime in January, and it would seem to be around the time of the new administration taking effect. So we'll have to wait and see. Any decision would be a 3-judge panel decision. If it's a decision that strikes down all or part of the FCC decision, the order would go back, or that part of the order would go back to the FCC. If it upholds the FCC's decision, industry would have an opportunity to petition the DC Circuit to review the decision, what's called en banc, or have the full DC Circuit set of judges review the case. But yeah, we're continuing to see a lot of problems. And again, the core challenge is avoiding case-by-case or factual inquiries, and that's really the legacy of this 2015 decision. It created more uncertainty and unsettled issues, despite being ostensibly an effort to provide clarity.
So if the DC Circuit were to strike it down and it gets sent back to the FCC, does that mean none of the rulings that we're looking at on the screen would be enforced at that point?
Potentially. The court could strike down all or part. So they could pick the parts that they think the FCC didn't get right, or where it went outside its jurisdiction, outside its authority under the statute, and send that back to the FCC for a redo. But what they send back, if anything, and why it goes back, or if they give any guidance as to what the FCC did wrong, will be critical.
Right. And any inside baseball or scoop on what do you think some things here they'll never change, or any sense of what potential could be?
The DC Circuit has historically been very difficult to read the tea leaves solely from the oral arguments. But I will say, from the oral arguments, one issue that seemed to cause the bulk of concern among the three-judge panel was the FCC's auto dialer interpretation. There seemed to be concerns about both the lack of the random or sequential number generator, the lack of, having read that piece out of the statute, the interpretation of future capacity, or including technologies that would still need to be modified to give certain capabilities, as well as this concept of having the technologies that we would think of as auto dialing installed at the time of the call, but not using them. There was at least one judge that seemed to think you needed to not just have the technology installed and ready to go, but to actually be using them on your call. So there was a lot of discussion in the case on all of the different issues that were raised, but the auto dialer one, and potentially appropriately so, was the one that got the most attention in terms of what seemed to be skepticism from the judges about what the FCC did. The issue, though, is that even if you say, okay, well, maybe the court will send that issue back for the FCC, it's not automatic what they would say or what the problem would be. So they might say certain pieces of the analysis are overbroad, but then uphold other pieces. So that's what we have to really hone in on when we see the decision.
Got it. Thanks. And shifting to just the new administration coming in January, Becky, thoughts on administration that's that's going to be much more business friendly versus consumer friendly, and the impact that it could have on TCPA?
Well, I think we are all expecting a sort of less regulatory environment with the FCC sort of as a general matter. Both Commissioner Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly, who are Republican members of the FCC, and Commissioner Pai is considered the likely choice to be interim chair. Both of those commissioners gave speeches yesterday at a think tank forum, and they reiterated that that they're looking to turn back some over regulatory, what they would describe as regulatory excess. Their speeches, in fact, sound a little bit like people are gardening, because they're cutting out the regulatory undergrowth and the like, and calling for more openness and transparency, which would be a wonderful thing, since the FCC is the only regulatory authority I know that can vote on a rule that's not yet written or published. So I think that in general, there's going to be less regulatory enthusiasm and a bit more regulatory restraint. That said, it's one thing when you're talking about agency enforcement of an established rule. It's another thing altogether, as it is here, where the agency enforcement isn't the biggest concern. It is the courts, and of course, there are some more formal procedural things that would need to happen to address excesses here. As Mark mentioned, how the D.C. Circuit sends back the case and what the issues are will make a big difference. But even if even if the court were to uphold the rulemaking, then the question is, what could a less regulatorily inclined commission come up with? And I think both Pai and O'Reilly, who will remain on the commission, were fairly critical of the declaratory ruling. But I think it's worthwhile, and maybe Mark, you can talk a little bit about sort of what happened, what would happen if how the FCC would go about modifying the declaratory order.
Certainly, and this is an area where they will have a variety of tools. So there's not one path or even necessarily one preferred path. To start, there are a number of efforts currently underway across agencies and in coordination with Congress to consider whether any recently adopted and finalized or published rules, agency rules, would be reviewed by Congress. There's some special legislation out there, the Review Act, where Congress can in a more streamlined way knock out a bunch of agency rules in one piece of legislation. And so there are efforts already underway to see what's been happening in the last few months and reaching back as far as they can to unwind some things that have been happening under this administration. So there's that. And alongside that, there's also the potential that Congress could at any time seek to take up TCPA legislation. At the FCC, they, for any recently adopted rules, they have mechanisms to pull those rules before they're published. I don't think we have anything on the TCPA that squarely fits that for the FCC, but certainly on some other consumer-facing issues, there are tools at the FCC for that. On pending litigation, the FCC can choose to withdraw any decisions that are under appeal and voluntarily take another look. So that's something to be thinking about in terms of the D.C. Circuit appeal, or that separate also D.C. Circuit appeal of the fax decision that the FCC put out a couple years ago. On core proceeding issues, the FCC can further clarify anything it wants to. So if things are not settled by the D.C. Circuit or the auto dialer issue comes back to them, they could look to craft a more clear and hopefully more helpful approach to interpreting the auto dialer definition. Things like reassigned numbers and consent revocation, something that it's harder for the FCC to do with the clarification. Remember, clarifications have retroactive application. Something it's harder for the FCC to do with a clarification is to do a 180. Anytime you want to take something that's been effectively clearly stated and do a 180, that's where you start talking about the need to do a formal rulemaking, go through the comment periods, and then land with some new rules based on that record with a date they go into effect in the future, and then from calls and texts from that time forward would be subject to the new rules. So I think for the TCPA, it's going to be a mix of balancing what can be done to clarify or take back things that have gone into the courts. Failing that, look for ways to issue new clarifications that provide some more practical benefit to callers. And then also where the FCC has just gotten it wrong over the years with the rules, to either waive the rules, waiving some of the rules may not prevent the litigation, though I keep that in mind. There's a difference there, or to change the rules going forward with the rulemaking. And I think that sort of maps out some of the key pieces.
So
we'll also continue to see
like
potential waiver requests.
And so does it sound like reassigned phones or managing consent are unlikely to change very much, even though the auto dialing could get modified?
No, it's unclear.
Okay.
I mentioned earlier that I think those parts of the order didn't get as much airtime in the oral arguments in terms of skepticism, but that's not to say that a new administration would want to bless the same approach. Now, for reassigned calls to reassign numbers, that's always been a difficult one for the agency to handle with a clarification, because they can't really make a full set of rules and conditions and requirements like they would with a rulemaking, because they're supposed to just be clarifying what the state of the law is. So they went pretty far in terms of drafting things out of the blue in the last decision, but even so, you can't go through you can't propose a full set of detailed rules. They could, for example, switch to the other preferred outcome on reassigned numbers, which is the intended recipient should be deemed the called party, so rather than the current subscriber or customer or user. And if they wanted to impose some reasonableness standard to make sure callers didn't keep their heads in the sand, I mean, they would seem to have some authority to do that. On consent revocation, the easy clarification would be to provide some more color on what is and is not reasonable means. So if the commission said you can revoke consent at any time, well, I suppose they could clarify any time, but that's a little bit more transparent. But at any time, through any reasonable means, I think the reasonable means piece has created a lot of challenges for us, and that's where getting a new administration to provide some color on what that means and to help us create a practical solution there would be very helpful.
Yep. Well, that's great. Thank you for the background on that. But let's shift to ruling that came out more recently around federal debt rulemaking, and I think people maybe had expected this to be more lenient when it was coming out, and it seems to be even more restricted in dealing with reassigned phones and getting the actual correct party. Maybe we could just touch on this for a minute.
So yeah, I think
or Becky.
Yeah, I think it's true that when the Congress acted on this, many people thought that this was going to be a fairly straightforward exemption if you were collecting federal debt. The FCC's rules for this are in fact quite strict, limiting the number of calls and really placing a premium on right party contact, so no more than 3 calls within a 30-day period.
I'll switch us to the next area too as you talk through this.
Okay, you confused me by changing the slides, but I think that it is significantly more restrictive. The covered calls can, who can place the covered calls, who they can be placed to, and what kinds of numbers that they can be placed to. Now, numbers obtained from a third party, providing that they're actually the number of the debtor, for example, is giving with one hand and taking away with another, I think. So in general, I think that the rules that apply to this exemption make the exemption extremely narrow and don't reduce the premium on right party contact at all.
Great.
A takeaway on the federal debts piece, the rules were published in the Federal Register on December 16th, so the window for petitions for reconsideration, or if anybody wants to ask the FCC to take up the issue again and maybe stay a bit more true to Congress's intent, those petitions are due, I'm sorry, I said December, it appeared November 16th, and the petitions for reconsideration are due December 16th, so a week from Friday. Court appeals, you'd have another month.
And if I could just ask a question, Mark, if the FCC grants a petition for reconsideration, then what is the status? We have the statute, but no rules.
Well, correct, with one caveat that the filing of a petition for reconsideration doesn't toll the effectiveness of the rules. So to your question, if they grant, like you mentioned, and do away with the rules, the statute remains in place. So just like it is today without any rules yet in effect, parties that are in litigation, the statute itself is pretty clear on the exemption. It appears, the way it's worded is if you're calling solely to collect a debt owed to or guaranteed by the federal government, that call is essentially treated the same as an emergency under the statute, no consent needed. There's separate language that speaks to the FCC's authority to adopt rules to implement that provision, but at least one court, I believe, has found, I think it's a few now, have found that provision to be self-effectuating. So as long as the FCC's rules are not yet in effect, then parties can still point to that exemption. It's not something that is well settled under the law, but there are arguments that that the exemption applies based on the statute alone, and it's only if and when FCC rules go into effect that you would have those limits, whatever they may ultimately be.
Great. Well, thank you. And the last slide on our legal analysis is looking at the CFPB Outline of Proposed Rules. Certainly, the Outline of Proposed Rules covered a lot of ground. We're going to focus on one area of ground as it relates to communication efficiency, which talked about limiting excessive or disruptive communications. That collectors would be limited to 6 communication attempts per week, whether that's email or mail or text or phone calls. So the question is, what are the timing and steps for proposed rules to become regulation? And given the new administration and the challenges of the CFPB, how likely is this to become something in the near term? Becky, can you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, I think again, we don't have a good sense of how the Trump administration will feel about this. This is not it's not a final rule yet. There are going to be new people in place at the CFPB, and in any case, it's going to take a while to get down to sort of appointments there, and then it will take them a while to get up to speed. So I don't think that we're talking about an imminent effectiveness on this front.
And we started to talk to some companies about it, and I think, what we're seeing, as I shared in the beginning, is, depending on where this goes, a further shift towards RPC efficiency and being even more precise in when phones get called to yield the most number of RPCs. But Mark, anything on the CFPB outline that you'd want to share, and then we're going to switch over into the operational analysis and a case study on calling efficiency.
Well, one sort of odd observation that ties back to that FCC proceeding. After receiving a special exemption from the TCPA for federal debts, if you compare what the FCC landed with in August on those calls versus the CFPB's proposal outline, there's an argument that now, in light of what the FCC did, federal debt collection calls are more heavily restricted in quantity and approach than private sector debt collection calls. So that's, I think, interesting commentary. With respect to the outline itself, there continues to be this emphasis, and this is something that may cut across political side, so I think it remains relevant for new administration. There continues to be this sense of trying to encourage and facilitate the right party contact and to protect against an outsized number of calls to the wrong person. But I think there's a lot of different views on how you craft those incentives and what the hard limits should be. So those proposals seem to allow both a number of attempts to reach the person and a number of actual conversations, and to reflect that there may be times where you need to have more than one discussion. But as a general matter, once you've connected with somebody on the phone or hear from them by text, then for that channel anyway, that's your opportunity, so you need to make the most of that opportunity. I think it's a reflection also that we I think industry here tends to do that as it is. The problem now is how much, if any, weight these proposals will have under the new administration, and as Becky mentioned, as they get settled, and where things will go from here on both timing and substance. So the outline itself hit with some interesting connotations and feedback from industry, but it still left a lot to be desired in terms of the practical implementation.
Well, Becky, Mark, thank you so much for your time, and I know you'll be around for Q&A at the end. We're running a little longer than we planned. We'll still make sure there's Q&A time, but we're going to switch now into an operational analysis, a framework for tackling TCPA, and then we'll still dig into some actual case study and efficiency results. So I'm going to invite Brad Day to join us now. Brad, you do a lot of work across banks and collection agencies and federal agencies in helping companies analyze, come up with plans, and implement activities as it relates to TCPA. Can you talk us through the approach you take and what you find most effective?
Sure. Thanks for having me. What I've laid out here is an approach that I've found works, for all the variety of parties that are trying to tackle it. As you touched upon, first, third party, whether it's a government agency, whether it's issuers. This is a construct that isn't perfect, but I think it more often than not kind of fleshes out where effort needs to be exhausted, and most importantly, what parties need to be involved in the conversation. So what I've laid out here is what I'm just calling the 4 pillars of compliance, and you'll notice that it ties back pretty nicely to the proposed rulings, the proposed rulemaking, and hits on the major topics and the ones where I found a lot of the difficulty resides. And those are consent is the first, systemic execution against that as a call out. As you notice, consent also falls under there. Phone number management, and then finally the processes. And processes rolls across all of the previous pillars. But given the importance and where I see the most risk resides, it merited a call out, because more often than not, there are numerous parties and numerous processes involved to flawlessly execute on something as complex as this. So if I'll just hit on a couple of the key points, I'm not going to go through it in detail, and then we can answer some questions. But the consent topic, really what that has done, particularly at some of the larger banks that I'm engaged with, is really looking at where where that phone number, where ultimately that consent came. Did it come at application stage? Was it done after that? And then, as Mark was touching upon, the ability to look at revoking that. There's still some definition to be made on by any means and how that can be done in a reasonable manner to revoke that consent. But the important thing being noted that the consent is done at the phone number level, and you have to be, it's supposed to be tied to the effort for which the debt was incurred. So if I'm filling out a credit card application and I give you that phone number and I consent for it to be used for collection-related activities, if you follow the letter of it, if I was then to open up a mortgage account, I would ultimately have to offer an additional consent for it to be used in, related to mortgage-related, debt collection efforts. And so that topic of how that consent is acquired, where did it come from, and then ultimately have the binary flag of yes or no at a phone number level, forces a lot of challenging conversations, to work through. And the second pillar kind of touches upon the big part around that of the systems. So, once you have that phone number, once you have that binary consented or not, how is that acted on in the course of your day-to-day activities? And if you're, using an auto dialer, being able to act on that. If you're in the collection system, being able to act upon it. Some people have redundancies for controls, where that restriction and looking for that consent flag is done in both places, looking at it at the dialer level and at the collection system, and sometimes even at the underlying data warehouse level. And being able to have all those parties interact with each other, as that work list is generated, creates a lot of sequencing and, to be honest, a number of different parties that need to be involved in that. At some of the banks, just to kind of frame it up, I've worked at, a number of the top 5 issuers, and just on this simple topic, some of the parties that I've seen at the table when talking about TCPA compliance, obviously are in IT, operations, you have individual lines of business, you have legal at the corporate level, you have legal at the individual bank line of business level, and then I've also started to see voice of customer show up, as those efforts have picked up and those organizations have been built out at the larger banks. Those parties also have a presence and many times are deemed to be the, quote, owners of the relationship. And then they ultimately own that phone number and have the most say, even though they're not dialing against it, perhaps the operations group is. And so as you could hear from that kind of broad conversation, there's, a lot of various participants just to talk about this topic of TCPA with multiple parties that it takes to fully tackle the problem. Phone number management is the last pillar that I'll touch upon here, but this is really looking at some of the things that we were touching upon later about earlier around reassigned phone numbers. How do you ensure that some of these numbers, many of which you had from a legacy system, maybe, many of which you had from when the customer first came into your purview, how do you know that that number still resides with Brad Day? How do I go about making sure that that still is, in the, a landline that hasn't been ported to a wireless or vice versa? How, if Brad has multiple accounts, how do I tackle that? Cosigners, how does that work? Ultimately, I like to think of it, almost as like an Apple card. You kind of have numbers coming and going. Those numbers are ultimately could be coming in from, at the app stage, at a bank level, at your outside collection agency, at
skip tracing internal, skip tracing at the agency, and ultimately, to touch upon the process real quick, you have to make sure that however those numbers flow into your universe, that they get exposed to this process that you've built. And so looking at the timing and the sequencing of ultimately that number flowing in, getting to a base position where it can be looked at to see if it was, previously sent out for an external party. No need to do it twice if you've already done it for the same number. And that forces a conversation where, some banks choose to keep all numbers for a period of time and clearly denote them, where some, want to remove that number, and ultimately if it comes back in again, they'll deal with it incrementally. So that ebb and flow of numbers, where they're coming from, who got it, was it consented, is really the guts of this process, and it has to be done flawlessly in order for people to feel that they've got their arms around this. And ultimately people are building for the worst. So everyone's, for the example of number of contacts, people are trying to design the visibility to look at omni-channel, to see if I send them 3 emails and I sent 2 texts in pre-default and I did 3 calls. They're building for that, and then ultimately it's just a matter of going back later when the final rules come out that either they throttle it up to 10 or throttle it down to 3 based on where the final regs are.
Thanks, Brad. That's it's a very nice framework to look at it and kind of break down TCPA. As we deal with communication efficiency, and we talked about diving into one aspect of it, of phone number management and reassigned phones. We know this is an area where while companies are dealing with a compliance issue, there's also operational gains and efficiencies to be had. What gains are companies achieving as they deal with reassigned phone numbers as you work with them?
Well, when you go through and go out to external scrub, whether you're using Neustar or others, I mean, you have to go through that activity to learn about that phone number and who that phone number belongs to. And if we're going to the path of where I only have a limited number of times to call, a lot of the conversations are, that same data flow that came back to say this number still belongs to Brad ultimately has a confidence score associated with that as well. So this is a number that they're very confident that belongs to Brad, and it's been used at this many times, recently as last month. Well, if I've only got 6 contacts to reach out to Brad, I would be crazy not to prioritize that one, at the best time and based on the day part that the information that is returned to me. So you almost have to filter this world where you have to ration off to your attempts. And the unsophisticated companies are, just using those attempts, and they're using them in the same day part, and it might still always reside in that same dialer campaign. Whereas you could, you're solving a reputational and a legal risk, while at the same time can also afford yourself some operational efficiencies. And I think that's how I look at the reassigned numbers problem. It's using the same data that's coming back to solve one problem, but ultimately while you're there can inform you to achieve some of the operational efficiencies that really we need to get to.
Well, and I think that's a great segue into the case study we'll walk through in the new Skiptrace solution that we're offering at Neustar, and we really look at these two things together, both managing risk and bringing greater efficiency. And I think, as Brad and I talked, it's very similar to the segmentation on accounts that agencies have done for a long time, now looking at bringing segmentation and more insight to a more granular level at the phone number level. So as quick background, and we'll probably go through 3 o'clock and then still take 15 minutes of questions. Neustar is a very unique relationship with the telco industry, and as a data company, we've been around for over 20 years, and we often say we're a phone-centric data company. We do several things where we help the telecommunications industry manage identity. We power the majority of all the caller ID in the U.S. today. We put out directory assistance in the U.S., so every day as landline phones are connected and disconnected, we put out that daily information in the market. We manage porting data for wireless phones and do market share analytics. So we do lots of different things for the telco industry, and we manage a large repository of data that is both authoritative and current that we use for consumer verifications across the financial, telco, e-commerce industry, as well as helping large organizations across verticals manage TCPA risk. So we say we get measured, one record at a time, billions of times a day, in linking individuals to their phone numbers. The service that we have, the Neustar verification for TCPA and our new Skiptrace service, is pretty basic. It's actually not an easy thing to solve for phone ownership. There's no silver bullet that gives you that information. And so we've built out a solution that solves the question or answers the question through several ways. So this is a very high-level overview. On the left-hand side is the input information. It takes in name, phone number, can take in address and email, data consent. And the output includes a verification. So is this phone verified to the consumer? It includes phone type information, is it wireless or landline? Phone activity information of is this phone active and has it been active for a certain period of time or inactive? Is it a VoIP phone? Has it been discontinued since the date you've got consent? And we look at all those things together to determine a good phone versus a phone that we believe has been reassigned, disconnected, or belongs to somebody else. And that's the core service that we're working across the collections, financials, and other verticals with to help with TCPA today. And we'll walk through a few analyses, both for first-party and third-party collectors. Some of the new things that we have rolled out are things like things that deal with best time of day to call somebody, or whether a phone's likely to be answered, and an alternate verified phone number that we have and can authoritatively provide. And these things start to help answer the challenge that may be created by the proposed rules of a limited number of contacts. And if I have the right phone, now I not only want the right phone, I want to know when I should initiate a call to get me to my greatest RPC efficiency. So everybody puts them in their own business rules, but we'll walk through some actual data so everyone can see some examples. And in detailing some of the phone activity insights we have for optimizing dialing performance that go along with just a verification of whether or not an individual still belongs to their phone, there's really three core pieces that we provide. The first is the phone activity status, where we look to say, hey, how long has the phone been active? And certainly we see phones that are active for more than 12 months or more. They tend to belong to good people who are going to answer their phone, and the RPC rates are much higher than certainly phones that are inactive. We look at best time to call, and we look at morning times or afternoon times in increments where we can provide insight based on activity of when we think best time to reach somebody, and they're most likely to answer the phone. And then we can look at an actual phone and say, hey, based on usage, do we think that this phone is likely to get answered or not? And we can look at phones within a portfolio and say, hey, these phones seem low in terms of a likeliness to get answered versus very high of a likeliness to get answered. So an example at the bottom here is you could take a phone number that's a wireless phone number and have insight along with, yes, this phone number is verified and belongs to the consumer. We can say it's been highly active for 12 months or more. Here's a great best time to call, and it's likely to be answered. And if you put that next to 3 other phones you have for an account, and they're inactive or very low in a likeliness to be answered, we can help companies optimize their RPC efficiency, optimize their performance, and manage the number of dials that they're making. So we'll look at an actual distribution of results when we put phone portfolios through our verification engine. And this is looking at both a first-party example and a third-party example. The color coding here is very much like a stoplight. So greens are where we can verify that an individual is linked to a phone. Yellow is just not sure, no data to confirm or deny a relationship. And in the red and orange categories, those are phones where we believe they're disconnected or linked to additional people. The takeaway here is that first-party tend to have much better phone information than third-party agencies, as it's mixed with a lot of Skiptrace data and data over a longer period of time. But you can see that, and the results within first and third-party vary, but the risk lies and the inefficiency lies in those areas of orange and red, and even yellow, where there's lots of phone numbers that are potentially unlikely to achieve an RPC. And as you use them within your organization, it's inefficient time or inefficient effort in terms of the gain that you get back. So we're going to use this third-party distribution as a case study to look at RPC rates and dollars collected and where there are efficiency gains to be had in your outreach effort. So if we look at that portfolio, 53% of the phones we were able to, or about 55% we were able to verify. This is now looking at two pieces of information. It's looking on the left-hand side at phones that are active and inactive, and it's looking across the top at a distilled version of phones that were verified, in the middle column, phones that were unverified, and on the right, phones that were wrong, disconnected, or reassigned. And we won't spend a lot of time on this slide. There's an easier version to digest next. The takeaway is this. These are RPC rates within the cells. So in the upper left-hand quarter, where it's green, you can see these are phones that are both verified and have been active for a longer period of time. And what you can see here is that the RPCs are 2, 3, 4x the average RPC, which is at 2.26%. And we can consolidate these color codings to deliver an operational strategy that brings efficiency to an organization. And we can help companies focus on phones where they're going to receive a right party contact and collect revenue. So in the next slide, we'll distill this down into an operational strategy. But this is the takeaway. It's very granular, and we can look at a combination of cells where there tend to be lots of RPCs. In the next slide is where we consolidate all of those greens and yellows and oranges and reds into categories of best, better, bad, and worst phones to call. And this is a combination of phone ownership and phone activity status. And the takeaways are those phones that are in the best categories, they're active and belong to the individual. The average RPC rate is much higher than in the worst category. Right? So the top 20% of phones, which are the best phones, have an RPC rate of 7.5%. Dollars collected per dial at $38.46. So in the best, better, and bad rows, it's 55% of the phone numbers in a portfolio, and it accounts for 92% of the collected revenue. So in the worst category, in that red row, 44% of the phones reside in that category. That means they're either inactive phones or they don't belong to those individuals. And what we see is a very low RPC rate and very low dollars collected per dial. So, as companies are dealing with TCPA and deciding which phones they're willing to auto dial and which ones go into a manual environment, it becomes very clear that the worst phones in a manual environment don't make very good business sense. There's a lot of effort and little revenue gained and little RPCs to be had. So there's clear efficiencies to be gained, as the effort was about mitigating TCPA risk, and the gain was significant operational efficiencies. Where we're moving now is to say, for those worst categories, there's two additional things we can do. Now we can help you optimize your dialing with greater insights around best time of day to call, or whether a phone is most likely to get answered or not, or what likeliness a phone is to get answered. And we can now take those worst phones, those records where we say, hey, that phone it's bad, it's in the worst category. We can now append authoritative phones to that category, so we can help them move those up into the best, better, or bad areas, and try to help you achieve additional RPCs and dollars collected. And we'll walk through that next. I'll go through this quickly for the sake of time so we can wrap up and do questions. In terms of appending new authoritative phones, our skip tracing service is brand new. We're very excited about it. This is a recent analysis we did for a top 10 bank. We've built out a persistent key over the last year where we can unlock high-quality, authoritative, verified landline and wireless information. We've had this data for years. We haven't been in the business of appending it. We're now in the business for some of the data that we can unlock, appending it out for use in collections and in other vertical markets. So in a test of 24,000 records that had failed name phone verification, where we said, hey, these are in the worst category, this is a breakdown of what we're able to provide. So 37% of those records we could give back a phone that we could say authoritatively verified to the individual. They break down, 35% were landlines, 65% were wireless. We had additional phones where we could verify it to the address only, to 55% of the records, and 53% were landline and 47% were wireless. So I think the takeaway is we have great authoritative, high-quality phone data that we can now append. As part of the verification process for TCPA, there's an ability to append out these additional phones. I think that brings us to the summary, so we're right in at the hour, and we'll stay around to take questions for another 10 minutes. So the takeaway is we don't believe TCPA is going away. There may be some changes coming in, and we're all anxiously awaiting the results of the appeal in the D.C. Circuit Court. I think TCPA is here to stay. How it gets modified and changed over time, we will wait to see. But we see an emphasis on RPC efficiency coming, and companies that are dealing with data and intelligence are going to continue to not only mitigate their risk, but we believe achieve efficiencies. Working systematically on your processes is fundamental, and we know most companies out in the market are approaching TCPA in many ways. Authoritative, accurate data and additional insights. We're working to provide more and more data that can help companies meet the demands in the market as they look to become more and more efficient. And I'll end it there and take us to a Q&A period. So thank you to everybody for staying with us. I think we've had most people stay with us through the end, so thank you for that. I'd like to thank Brad and Mark and Becky for joining us, and I think we have now time to take some questions, so I'll ask Jennifer to throw some questions our way.
Thank you, Mitch. Yes, we have a couple of logistical questions about access to a copy of the slides and the webinar recording, and we will be making those available in the next few days, distributing a recording of the webinar as well as the slides. So everybody that was on the distribution will receive those in the next few days. If there's any questions, please enter those in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to address those. Okay, we're seeing some questions come in. Here we go. On the legal front, has anyone attempted to cite the Spokio case as a defense? And that
so this is Becky.
Okay.
I think that Spokio case has been cited, and I mean, that it hasn't been that much time, and the courts have gone both ways. Some have said, you know, the call itself is not adequate harm. It's not a showing of harm, and other courts have said it is. So I think I'd be interested in Mark's take on that. But I think the jury's still out on whether Spokio is going to change the extent to which the class actions are a good vehicle for TCPA.
Thanks, Becky, and agreed. It's something that has become a very common and increasingly integral part of the defense strategy in terms of raising the spokio arguments. What I expect in the short term that this will produce is some additional attention to detail by the plaintiff side in drafting the complaints. But there have been a number of interesting defense theories, and courts, again, are it's a patchwork of decisions, and we don't have a lot of nationwide guidance to go off of, but there are examples where the spokio defense, or things stemming back to spokio, have raised issues regarding whether there was any harm whatsoever from a missed call, and whether there was any harm from answering a single call if, for example, there were no unique charges to that call, things like that. And kudos to the defense bar for being creative about how to help make these cases go away. Again, to Becky's point, I think the litigation will continue, but it's going to be a higher bar now for the plaintiff side to draft their complaints to avoid dismissal in some courts.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have here is, when do you anticipate the CFPB proposed rules will go into effect at the 6 contact limit?
This is Mark. I think that it's very difficult to predict the timing on that, because in order to do that, you have to assume that the next administration will continue to bless that overall strategy, that approach, and continue down the same path, and we just don't have anything confirming that, so it remains to be seen. But even under the current administration, things were looking ahead to second half of next year, so I don't know how you would land much sooner than that, but again, frankly, the issue is whether any rules would be adopted in any way resembling what had been outlined previously.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, will the service just presented increase contact rates, RPCs, reduce risk for TCPA, FDCPA violations?
Do you ask that again, Jennifer?
Will the service just presented increase contact rate, RPC, reduce the risk for TCPA, FDCPA violations?
I mean, that's absolutely what it's doing. I mean, one of the challenges with TCPA is calling out the reassigned phone numbers, and I think what you see with the distributions that we showed for both first-party and third-party examples is there's a lot of phones that people have that are in a bad category, which pose a lot of risk, which are both which is where all the risk lies, right? If you continue to dial or auto-dial those phone numbers. So, one, you have to know which ones they are, and secondly, if you remove them, you're working much more efficiently. Now, there could always be lawsuits, but the issue is if your exposure is less, you're in a much better place, and your operations is in a more efficient place. So, we can't say exactly how everything plays out, but the less, the more you're contacting the right people, the less exposure you have to TCPA risk, absolutely.
Okay, thank you much. There's another question about spokio defenses. For those of us who do not know, what is the spokio defenses?
Well, let me keep this short because we're running low on time, but it stems from the Supreme Court's spokio decision, which crafted some parameters on the extent to which plaintiffs can pursue claims without establishing certain kinds of harm. So when you look at the TCPA, for example, the statute includes statutory damages, so flat damages, It can be read as strict liability, so if you don't comply, here's the stated damages. There's really no discussion of showing of harm. And in situations like this, there were constitutional issues raised as to whether that type of approach and penalty is lawful, and the Supreme Court issued its decision, as I said earlier this year, and put some parameters for the types of showings you need to make to get past that harm threshold. And alongside that, there are concerns about a series of cases out there that also tie into the extent to which you can, whether there's any harm remaining if you do not, if the defendant is offering to provide the requested amount. So if the defendant, this is a separate case scenario, but if the defendant is offering to pay the requested damages to the plaintiff, is there really still a claim? And there are situations that tie from that as to whether, okay, if it's not enough to make the offer, is it enough if you actually put the money in the bank account and so forth? So all these arguments stem both on harm and whether there's any real unresolved claim to be had.
Okay, thank you. Well, it looks like we're about out of time here. Any other questions that have been submitted through the question and answer panel we will address following. But thank you for all the questions that came in, and thank you for the responses from the panelists.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good holiday.
Yeah, once again, I just want to thank all of you for spending part of your afternoon with us, and want to especially thank Becky, Mark, Mitchell, and Brad for their time and expertise used today in putting the deck together and presenting the deck to us and answering our questions. If you have any questions about the content of today's presentation, feel free to email Mitchell, whose address is on the screen, or me at editor@insidearm.com, and we'll do our best to get it answered. And please take a look at our survey and fill it out if you have the time. Your feedback is always appreciated, and it'll help us serve you better. And that'll do it for today. See you next time. Hope you all have a wonderful day. You can now safely disconnect from the webinar.